que este pone. All right. Good morning, everyone. My name is Miguel Escoto. I'm a senior at FIU, majoring in international relations and political science with certificates in national security and Latin American and Caribbean studies. I'm currently based here in DC through the FIU and Washington, DC programs, such as the Hamilton Scholars Program with the Honors College, as well as the Green School semester in DC, where I'm taking relevant coursework relevant to our policymaking processes in the US. I'm currently interning with the Atlantic Council's Adrienne Arsht Latin America Center, tackling the portfolios of Central America, Colombia, and security. Now, today marks the very first official event since the announcement of the partnership between FIU and the Atlantic Council. Now, let's please welcome our Dean of the Green School, Dean Dinar. Thank you.
Good morning, everyone. It's a real pleasure to be here. And welcome to FIU in Washington, D.C., the universities, and our hometown of Miami's embassy in our nation's capital. And thank you so much, Miguel, for that introduction. I have the pleasure of being the Dean of the Stephen J. Green School of International Public Affairs at Florida International University. And it's really a privilege for me to open today's program on the implications of Middle East security trends for Latin America and the Caribbean. Let me first and foremost begin by extending our sincere gratitude to our lead collaborator, the Atlantic Council's Adrienne Arsht Latin America Center. Their leadership and commitment to advancing understanding across regions have been invaluable in shaping today's conversation. I'm also delighted to share, again, Miguel also touched on this, but I have to talk about it as well, Miguel, that FIU and the Atlantic Council's Adrienne Arsht Latin America Center have recently signed a memorandum of understanding. And this represents not only our shared commitment to advancing dialogue across the Americas and beyond, but also the beginning of a deeper, ongoing collaboration. We are very excited about the opportunities this partnership creates to amplify research, scholarship, foster exchange, and shape impactful policy conversations. In fact, we co-hosted our first event in mid-July in Panama. I think this was before it was official, right, before the MOU was signed, but it was our first event in mid-July in Panama, and it was a lunch in honor of FIU Green School alumnus, U.S. Ambassador to Panama, Kevin Marino Cabrera. And I'm grateful to Jason Marzak, Vice President and Senior Director at the Adrienne Arsht Latin America Center, for his partnership and his friendship. I'm also grateful to Valentina Sader, Deputy Director for Impactful Programming and Brazil lead, who played a pivotal role in coordinating this morning's event. Thank you, Valentina, and thank you, Jason. I want to take a moment to recognize FIU in Washington, D.C. It is here that FIU showcases the impact of our preeminent research teams, convenes national dialogues like this morning's, and supports student success, helping place over 100 students annually in internships and hosting over 700 students for short-term seminars in our nation's capital. And in fact, I know we have about 3 of our Green School students here with us this morning on a fly-in. If I'm not mistaken, they're here in the audience. They are pursuing internships for the spring semester. So for all of you in the audience and those who are participating online, if you are hiring, hire FIU. And all this would not be possible without our FIU in Washington, D.C. leads. So a very special thank you to Carlos Becerra, Senior Associate Vice President for Federal Relations, and Michelle Castro, Director of Student Experience and Impact. And this event also reflects the collaboration of several of our academic centers and institutes, the Jack D. Gordon Institute for Public Policy, the Kimberly Green Latin American and Caribbean Center, the Mohsen and Fauzia Jaffer Center for Muslim World Studies, as well as the Dorothea Green Lecture Series and the Ruth K. Shepard Broad Distinguished Lecture Series. Together, they exemplify our school's mission to bridge regions, foster dialogue, and address pressing global challenges. The security dynamics unfolding in the Middle East carry consequences that extend far beyond the region itself. Latin America and the Caribbean, in particular, are confronting ripple effects from shifting energy markets to the activities of non-state actors, developments that underscore the interconnected nature of global security in the 21st century. That is why today's discussion is so timely. By bringing together experts who examine these linkages through both regional and global lenses, we can better understand the challenges at hand and consider how governments and institutions can respond with foresight and resilience. On behalf of Florida International University and the Stephen J. Green School of International Public Affairs, I thank our partners for their collaboration, and I thank all of you and those online for joining us for what promises to be a highly engaging and consequential dialogue. In fact, we had a few changes, but we have an amazing, stellar panel. So it is now my pleasure to formally introduce our panel. And let me start with our moderator for today, Jason Marzak, who I mentioned earlier, Vice President and Senior Director at the Atlantic Council's Adrienne Arsht Latin America Center. In addition to leading the center, Jason has 25 years of expertise in regional economics, politics, and development, working with high-level policymakers and private sector executives to shape public policy. Next, I'd like to introduce Erik Lob, who is Associate Professor in the Department of Politics and International Relations at FIU's Stephen J. Green School of International and Public Affairs. His research focuses on the intersection of development and politics in the Middle East, with a focus on how state and non-state actors further their political interests, both domestically and internationally. He has also published on the Latin America ties of these actors. Kristen Fontenrose is president of Red 6 International and non-resident senior fellow at the Scowcroft Middle East Security Initiative of the Atlantic Council. Previously, she was director of the Scowcroft Middle East Security Initiative until December of 2021. Fontenrose also spent 2018 as a senior director for the Gulf at the National Security Council, leading the development of U.S. policy toward nations of the GCC, Yemen, Egypt, and Jordan. Daniel Erikson is former special assistant to the president and senior director for Western Hemisphere Affairs. He is also former deputy assistant secretary of defense for the Western Hemisphere. At the Atlantic Council, he is non-resident senior fellow at the Adrienne Arsht Latin America Center. And Gabriela Hoberman, who is the director of academic programs at the Kimberly Green Latin American and Caribbean Center at FIU Stephen J. Green School of International and Public Affairs. She also teaches in the school's Department of Politics and International Relations, and her areas of expertise are comparative politics, disaster risk policy, and Latin America politics, with research interests to include public policy, governance, and accountability. Jason, the floor is now yours with the panel. Thank you so much.
Okay, thanks.
All right, well, good morning, everyone. It's great to be back at FIU, and thank you, Shlomi, so much, Dinar, for that incredible introduction. And I also want to also thank the folks here at the FIU and DC office, and Carlos Becerra, you and your entire team. You guys are just such great collaborators on all things. And I want to reiterate the excitement around the partnership with FIU. As Dean Dinar said, we formally signed that partnership agreement back over the summer, but there's a long history of the Atlantic Council and FIU working closely together, whether in this building or beyond this building. All of the institutes that Dean Dinar mentioned, including Adam Smith Center and other centers that have worked closely with us over the years. Is that better? So I'm going to go ahead. So what I have on the panel here, Dean already mentioned the panelists. Kirsten Fontenrose to my right, and it's so wonderful to have you here, Kirsten. Kirsten's a longtime colleague from the Atlantic Council. I was even more thrilled when Kirsten used to work full-time at the Atlantic Council, but so wonderful to have you as a non-resident fellow, doing incredible work through our Middle East Center. Erik Lob really will bring incredible dynamic interventions on behalf of FIU. Gabriela Hoberman and Dan Erikson with us from the Atlantic Council as well. What we have on this panel, we have a mix Middle East experience as well as Latin America experience. as Dinar also mentioned, we originally were going to have Admiral Craig Faller as part of this conversation. He unfortunately had to recuse himself from this over the weekend. So we, as part of this panel, we now have the task of also adding in what Admiral Faller would have to say about this topic as well. So no small task for the panel. We're going to talk today about this question about how the Middle East security dynamics reverberate across Latin America and the Caribbean, and what else could we be potentially learning about what's happened in the Middle East over the years, and how is that applicable to the region, especially at this time where there's so much focus from the U.S. government, from the Pentagon on the Middle East, and also, of course, on the Western Hemisphere. We see, of course, the naval deployments to the Caribbean. We see as well the increase in the Department of War budget. And so looking at kind of what does that mean for the region in general. So we'll look at network threats, we'll look at tools and safeguards, maritime and supply chains, we'll also look at great power competition, and we will also look at what works, what we should be avoiding, and what are some of the lessons moving forward. I'm going to start off with just a broader question to the panel, and I'll start with you, Kirsten, just because you happen to be seated next to me. When we look at to set the stage, when you look at when you think about the Middle East, and we oftentimes don't link the Middle East and Latin America, and the Caribbean in the same conversation. But if we could help to understand what might be some of the connections between what we've seen in the Middle East over the years with regard to security threats, and how we should be thinking about these security threats in our own region. I'm going to ask the similar question to everybody on the panel just to get us started. So we'll keep it to a short, minute or two answer.
Unfortunately, I think we're seeing a resurgence in counterterrorism as a policy priority because what's old is new again. We have two geopolitical realities that are, I think, shaping the fact that a lot of the security threats we've talked about in years past, 2014, 2009, back to the 2000s, are front and center again. One is the degradation of Iran's defenses due to the Israeli strikes. Iran has three sort of pillars with which they conduct negative foreign policy, not the trade. One is their nuclear program, one is their missiles program, one is their proxies. All of these have been degraded. In terms of the proxies, they've essentially put their heads down where they haven't been degraded. Iran is actively seeking to reconstitute new proxies in new parts of the world, and they already have some footholds in parts of Latin America. So we're watching the bubbling up of this. The second geopolitical issue right now that's seeing us is the Gaza war. While it has also been a part of degradation of many of these proxies, we're seeing the terrorist groups, Hamas, Hezbollah, any of the Iran-backed affiliates, use this as a propaganda method for recruitment and fundraising, and we're seeing it successful among diasporas. They're moving a lot to online fundraising. They're maximizing the use of videos from inside the conflict itself, spreading those around the world to people who don't otherwise see this kind of material. And what they're also doing on the technology side is then shifting. We're seeing a lot more moving to trade-based money laundering. We're seeing a lot of movement to even crypto. So places that we traditionally haven't looked for proxy and militia level activity, we're now seeing quite a bit.
Thanks so much, Kirsten. So new proxies, propaganda, and new ways to find resources, financial resources. Erik, you've also, you spent a lot of your career looking at state, non-state actors and how they've kind of shaped development policy, taking advantage of that across the Middle East. How piggyback on Kirsten's answer, but also how are you seeing this new dynamic in the Middle East, and also with the broader kind of global connection of what's transpiring?
Well, yeah, just to add, these connections, and I specifically focus on Iran's connections with Venezuela and other ALBA states that are pushing back as the way they perceive it as U.S. imperialism and hegemony in Latin America. And so I primarily look at state-to-state connections and the different dimensions of those relations. And on top of what was described, there's been even dating back to the early 2000s, security cooperation between Iran, Venezuela, and other ALBA states, particularly in the area of military technology transfers, specifically Iranian drone transfers and cooperation. And so if there is a degradation of proxies and other pillars of Iran's security doctrine inside and outside the Middle East, the question is, now that both of these countries, I mean specifically Iran and Venezuela, are under tremendous military and economic pressure. Iran just going through this 12-day war, Venezuela looking at U.S. naval vessels right off its shores. The U.S. has now engaged twice in kinetic activity or operations right off of Venezuela's shores. So now, really what salvaged Iran's security during the 12-day war was its missile and drone arsenal. And so the question is, and now, the question, to what extent is Iran going to reconstitute these proxies or maybe move to new proxies? But if the key to the security was missiles and drones, then to what extent are we going to see greater cooperation in that area to push back against U.S. assets in the Middle East and Latin America? So that's a key issue that I would look for. And even during and after the 12-day war, we saw activity. I believe that they had sent officials and even journalists to Venezuela to signal that this relationship is not going away, despite the tremendous military and economic pressures that both of these partners face, which of course add constraint, but may also create opportunities. And certainly, as I've seen in my research and my data, even if it may cause constraints and capabilities, it incentivizes these actors to be more proximate in their relations and have greater intentionality in terms of pushing back against the U.S. Allies and partners in their respective regions.
So, Eric, something that we haven't yet focused on, look at the Middle East and look at how the implications of the Israeli strikes on Iran and what that means as far as Iran's degradation. How does Iran then respond, not just in the Middle East, but how does it maybe respond globally, right, including in regions like Latin America?
Right.
Gabrielle, I'd like to get your first take on this question. Where do you see kind of the intertwining between Middle East security threats and also security threats in the region?
Thank you, Jason. It's a pleasure to be here. To add to what my colleagues have said, and what we've seen is that it has been very difficult to predict and detect how these networks expand throughout Latin America. We know they are there. We know they are operating there. So what we can do is try to identify ways that we can mitigate, we can manage, and eventually prevent and detect. So what we have seen is that there are three areas in which they have engaged, such as illicit finance, political and economic influence, and acts of terrorism, as we have seen in Argentina, for example, with the two terrorist attacks in 1992 in the Israeli embassy, and then in 1994 in the AMIA, the Israeli-Argentine Mutual Association. Another characteristic that we have seen is that they establish their networks in areas in which there are porous borders. There is really a deficient control of the state and informal governance, and they thrive there, such as the tri-border area in Argentina, Brazil, and Paraguay, and they're very successful. We also seen how Iran, as my colleagues have said, have expanded their influence in countries like Venezuela or Nicaragua. So which actions can regional partners take in order to counter all this expansion and the spread of terrorist organizations? Well, the first one is political will. A decision to firmly target these networks and the expansion in the region. We've seen some actions, for example, Argentina, Colombia, Paraguay, Honduras, Guatemala, and very recently Ecuador have declared Hezbollah a terrorist organization. Second thing that we can improve is intelligence sharing. We see a lot of intelligence sharing with the United States, right? We see less of this capability within Latin American countries, and that is very, very important. It's challenging because we have all, the whole spectrum of political ideology and alignment right now in the region, but it's possible. Sustained diplomatic pressure that needs to continue, and ways to interrupt how these terrorist organizations are able to raise funds and launder them. Lastly, the question about legal enforcement and capabilities to legal enforcement to persecute and to target these organizations, and to ensure that our governments in Latin America are not susceptible to acts of corruption, and they are responsible and accountable to their citizens.
Wonderful. Thanks so much, Gabrielle. You know, as you were talking as well, I'm connecting your answer with also Kirsten's response as well, because Kirsten was mentioning we need to look at crypto, trade-based money laundering, and new ways of securing financial resources. And as you point out as well, we need to find ways to interrupt some of those funds across the region. And this long-time challenge of a lack of intelligence sharing among countries, right? That non-state actors take advantage of, right?
Yes,
Especially
absolutely.
in the region. I'm going to go to Dan. Dan, you spent a number of years walking the halls of the Pentagon, and also then at the NSC as well. So you've focused on you've had a laser focus on security issues across the hemisphere, and how they've also evolved over the years. How do you see some of the trends that we're seeing in the Middle East potentially impacting our region?
Great. Well, thank you, Jason, for the question. I just want to add my kudos to FIU and the Atlantic Council for organizing this event. A little bit of a dangerous mandate to ask us to channel Admiral Faller because he's a hard act to follow. But I did have a chance to work with him quite closely at the Pentagon, and one thing he always brought to the table was big picture thinking, really, and making sure that you understand what's happening in the region, what's happening in specific countries, but also what are the global connections, whether that has to do with China, Russia, Iran, or other actors. As some of my colleagues have covered, you have to look at this phenomenon of Middle East engagement with Latin America and vice versa in several layers. There's state-to-state engagement. Some of that is, in fact, positive. You can look at countries like Saudi, UAE, that's an important source of investment. Israel is a key security partner for many countries in the region as well, in terms of training, doctrine, and also technology investment. And then, of course, you have the illicit network piece of it, which is, for the most part, is quite negative and concerning. Another thing that I think is quite concerning is that if you were to look at what is kind of the strongest, longest standing alliance between a Middle Eastern state and a country in Latin America, it's clearly Iran and Venezuela. And that, I think, should concern all of us. The fact is that the two countries have maintained a strong relationship for many, many years and have, for a variety of reasons, been opposed to progress in the global order. A whole set of acts I won't run through here. I think a lot of this crowd is very familiar with it. But I think the fact that is kind of almost the defining relationship of the two regions is something to track. And then, looking forward, one thing that I think the United States can do with Latin American countries specifically is really strengthening the partnership, the ability to share information and intelligence in a timely manner. What I found at the Pentagon is that when we talk to partner countries in Latin America and the Caribbean about the threats posed by illicit terrorist networks emanating from the Middle East, it was a concern, but it wasn't a top concern. They went through their top 5 or 10 list. It would have to do with natural disasters, transnational criminal organizations cited in these countries, illegal mining, logging, deforestation. And so really having them kind of understand that while this may not be at the top of their day-to-day, it can really galvanize huge negative impacts in a short period of time, and ensuring that is a feature of how they think about their own security panorama.
Thanks, Dan. I think as you talk about huge negative impacts in a short period of time, as Gabriella said, we see that, right? We see that with the AMIA bombing and Argentina.
Argentina is a great example.
Yeah.
You don't have to explain to Argentina why this is a concern.
Exactly.
Absolutely.
Exactly. Or Venezuela. I mean, the threats that Nicolas Maduro poses, not just on a day-to-day basis for the Venezuelan people, but for the broader region as well, for a number of reasons, but among others, the Iranian ties. I want to drill down a little bit more on the spread of Middle East-based terrorist organizations. And Kirsten, pick up a point that you made in your introduction, where you were talking about new proxies coming from Iran, and also the propaganda that's being spread because of the continuation of the Hamas war. We see the Israeli incursions into Gaza City as well. And I think probably we haven't quite wrapped our head around what are the second and third order implications of this beyond the Middle East, right? And how we could be thinking about how some of these terrorist organizations might seek to kind of recalibrate given recent events, just rapid recent events in just the last 6 months or so. And so as you look at kind of the expansion potentially of such organizations, what's concerning to you insofar as that expansion and how that expansion could potentially kind of play out beyond the Middle East, and what should countries, what should governments be thinking about? Going back to Dan's point, I think Gabrielle, your point as well initially about not being as focused on the threat that Middle East-based terrorist organizations present. We've seen some of that threat in the hemisphere previously, but how should we be thinking about that differently, given the shifting dynamics in the Middle East right now?
Because I do think there's going to be a resurgence of some of this,
we're going to see more rather than less. We were lovely world scenario where we were moving toward an era of more peace, less conflict, at least in the Middle East. Now, rug has been ripped out from under that. Iran is expanding where it's looking because it's not finding proxies, is willing to stick their heads up in the Middle East. And what we're seeing across Latin America is predominantly financial facilitation, smuggling, things like that. So I think what we need to be ready for as partners is how to address that. You don't want to just import the Middle East model, because the CT model in the Middle East has an increasing focus on economic warfare and financial measures, but a lot of it also is looking at active operational terrorist cells, and we don't really have that situation in Latin America. You don't want to sort of over-weaponize, right? So some things I made a little list while you were talking. I think first you want to focus on standards. You want to use things like FATF and UN frameworks. You've got UN Security Council Resolution 1267 that sets out designations for AQ, Al-Qaeda affiliates, can link things to that. And you want to do this not because they're easy to enforce, these kinds of resolutions, but because it gives some durability and some legitimacy to any actions that governments take, and because then you can synchronize your designations as well if you choose to use that route with the US, with Europe, with the UN. Just gives if you are a government in Latin America and you choose to use a designation, linking it to these, allows you to have international law enforcement participation, gives you a few more tools. Second, I think use the right tool for the goal. So we've got foreign terrorist organizations, but sometimes you don't need to pull that lever. If you're looking mostly at financial facilitation, then it might be something like the specially designated terrorist group designation, which we have through an executive order and could be copied elsewhere, and certainly the US executive order could be applied. That's useful for things like banks or NGOs, where you're trying to get to the fact that they are assisting, they're providing some material support, but that organization itself is not the bad actor all the time. Those are easier to implement, they're faster, they're more flexible. I would say third, make sure you have humanitarian carve-outs if you do any of that. You don't want to choke off NGO assistance flows. You don't want to choke off legitimate trade. You don't want to scare off banks. That's not good for any of these governments. And then we can, as the U.S. and as partners, we can vet Latin American law enforcement, customs agents, and the like, using what we call Leahy vetting, mostly for human rights issues. That's the case around the world, not just for Latin America. When we do that, and we have partners that we can trust and empower, we can link them, as Gabriella was saying, to our financial intelligence units that are transnational, that kind of look at these flows around the world. That information sharing, that's the gap right now. I think anything that makes the mechanism stronger across borders in down south and with us and across the ocean is really helpful, because you're pulling in intelligence, you're pulling in this durability and this legitimacy I was talking about, the intelligence sharing being really the key part of it, and you're pulling in other tools as well, different authorities, different eyes in the sky even, so that's helpful. And then finally, I would say
The governments, one of the traps we've fallen prey to that we've learned about is how we communicate these. You want to make sure you're communicating very clearly that the targets are these organizations, which many of the populations won't be familiar with. They won't have seen them on the streets. They don't even know they're there. And you want to make sure that people understand we're not after you and your diaspora relatives sending money. We're after these organizations, so that you don't scare off banking and you don't scare off civic activity and you don't scare off legitimate trade, that kind of thing.
Excellent. Use the right tools and figure out and use those tools based on what's worked and what hasn't worked in the Middle East, and how do we? I think also what you're saying, Kirsten, goes back to the importance of cross-border. I think one of the themes of emerging is the importance of cross-border coordination, right? How do we not only make the mechanism stronger, but also get governments to work more closely together? Erik, I want to pick up on this question of incentives, and when you look at knowing kind of the operation of terrorist organizations in the Middle East, what are some of the incentives for them to potentially or not expand operations, given some of the dynamics that we're seeing into the region? And if you're looking at that, through which kind of modalities should we be looking at that expansion to occur?
I mean, again, and an important point was raised about looking at other Middle East actors that may have a positive or neutral effect in the region, something that I want to do more moving forward. Being more myopically focused on Iran in terms of the incentives that it has. And again, this is a bidirectional relationship, right? So Venezuela and its allies and partners in Latin America also have their incentives for wanting to engage. But I would say a big incentive off the bat is symbolic capital, that these are countries, again, as I mentioned, under tremendous military and economic pressure. They are feeling that there's an intentionality among the United States and its allies and partners to isolate these countries to the fullest extent possible. And so a big part of it is, in terms of researching these relations, is the symbolism of these relations, right? To show in the international system that they have friends. And also to legitimate themselves back at home, because when their publics and populations say, well, oh, our leaders are meeting with other leaders, even if they may not understand fully why they're meeting with specific leaders in specific regions, it also conveys a sense of legitimacy back home. And so a big part of these relations is the pomp and circumstance. These elaborate ceremonies of officials meeting together, of giving each other very honorable awards, of signing these agreements, even if they may not be fully implemented, or they may have major constraints in implementing these agreements. The ceremony and the spectacle itself have tremendous value to these countries in terms of symbolic capital and legitimation. Of course, like any countries, right? These relations are not necessarily sui generis or exceptional, because they're opposed to the United States. They're seeking very similar things on a substantive level, right? So they're seeking political and diplomatic support. An interesting thing to look at is their voting records in the UN and other international organizations. Are they going to vote or even abstain in favor of one another? Economically, what can these different sides bring to the table? Like any relations that countries would consummate. Particularly when you look at Iran and Venezuela, I mean, predating the Iranian Revolution and even Chavez, these relationships were predicated on petroleum production and price coordination in OPEC. Of course, looking at what they can bring in terms of trade, investment, finance, despite the constraints that they may face in terms of the sanctions that are imposed against them. And actually that incentivizes them to work together in areas like trade, investment, and finance. We see them establishing joint banks to circumvent sanctions and to facilitate transactions. So the constraints that they're under may actually create opportunities for them to expand that relationship and to cement it. Other areas constraints that they face aside from sanctions are mismanagement and corruption that these systems deal with, which get on the implementation side. So one thing to pay attention to is, while we may see big ceremonies with these cooperation agreements, we then see that there's not always follow through or the ability to follow through on these agreements, given the constraints that they're under, leading sometimes to disappointment and unmet expectations, which the United States and allies and partners can leverage to their advantage in those situations. I mentioned a little bit about the security cooperation, particularly the transfer of technology that Iran has. I mean, Iran is, given what it's able to do with its drones and missiles, and having a comparative advantage sometimes in price in other areas, is looking to expand its global drone market. And so these countries serve that purpose. And then finally, I would say, drilling down beyond the state level to the non-state level, it appears that what incentivizes the non-state actors like Hezbollah is more the illicit activities that we mentioned. I think maybe, if we look at the history of Latin America, and I'm not a Latin American specialist, so you can correct me, as tragic as the bombings were in Argentina, those may be outliers for these organizations in terms of trying to stay off the grid, not attract attention, and engage in illicit activities so they could support their operations and personnel back home rather than drawing more attention to themselves.
Those are excellent points, Eric. And I'll go to you, Gabriella. And actually, we didn't actually define the seating like this, but we have the Middle East first. And on this side of the panel, I'm kind of off the side, and the Latin America perspectives afterwards. And I'll also say we have about, I think, 15 minutes. So for those who are in the audience, feel free to start getting your questions together, and especially any questions that you think this panel has yet to address that Admiral Faller would have asked or would have said. Gabrielle, let me go to you. Are regional partners, you think, prepared for preventing, detecting, disrupting these networks? We talked earlier about the challenge. You mentioned the challenge in intelligence sharing. You mentioned Dan also mentioned some of the challenges insofar as kind of interrupting flows, interrupting funds. So, to what degree do you see there is that level of preparation, and what else do you think needs to be done?
Thank you, Jason. I think that Kirsten made an excellent point in terms of mentioning how difficult it is to extend and replicate what is being done elsewhere in Latin America. You have to look at the root causes. How are these networks interacting with organized crime, for example? How are these networks taking advantage of vulnerable communities? What is their incentive to become, have a higher profile? So I think that there is a lot of catch-up to do. I think they take advantage of informal networks, of course, of corruption, of illicit activities. And Latin America has the option either to engage with other countries in the region, because this solution is not going to come only from outside. There needs to be a local buy-in on how they are going to deal with these groups. Yes, you can do targeted sanctions, you can freeze their assets, prohibit financial transactions, but you have to invest in criminal justice. You have to invest in training of law enforcement that are able to prosecute, to investigate. These are activities that are very long-term and demand systematization. So there has to be coordination among different agencies. Very recently, there was a new agreement going back to the tri-border area, but again, we've seen it in Peru, we've seen it in Brazil, we've seen it in Bolivia very recently. So there was a new agreement, a regional agreement between Argentina, Brazil, and Paraguay to try to counter, these illicit activities, the role of terrorist organizations in the region, and identifying this threat as a national security threat. I think that that's progress. It's not enough. One thing that makes it very difficult in Latin America, and again, looking at the region right now and the different kind of approaches we have to public policy, it's to replicate and to identify good practices that can be replicated in different countries. It's going to be a challenge. It's really going to be a challenge. So international organizations, regional organizations have a key role to play to put that together, to help countries connect to each other. If it's not by their own will in trying to connect, to try to set up the right mechanism so this issue can be addressed, can be sustained, which is one of the most important things.
Thanks, Gabrielle. Dan, you're mentioning how well, I think it's important to also reinforce one comment you made that the relationship between the Middle East and Latin America goes far beyond terrorist organizations, right? You mentioned the importance. I think it's important to highlight again the importance of the strong state-to-state ties, the commerce, the investment, and we're seeing a growth of that investment. So I just want to highlight that as you mentioned that previously. You were also mentioning that the region isn't really kind of prepared for some of the potentially challenges that we might see. And I want to ask you, based on your time in the Pentagon so far, as how the U.S. has approached this previously, and maybe what has worked and what hasn't worked. And I'm going to also just put out there for you to pick up on or not the fact that since February 20th, Secretary Rubio has identified 14 entities as foreign terrorist organizations. 6 Mexican cartels, 2 transnational gangs, 2 Haitian gangs, 2 Ecuadorian criminal groups, and so this use of the FTO designation. So how is that designation? How can that better serve as a tool to combat the potential of additional security threats coming from Middle East-based terrorist organizations, or how is your experience in the Pentagon so far as what has worked or what hasn't worked emblematic for what we should be looking at moving forward?
Great, thanks for the question, Jason. And I also had a lot of thoughts before you asked the question on the other panelists' comments, so I'll put it into one seamless answer.
Wonderful.
So if you're seeking to counter illicit networks in Latin America and the Caribbean, whether they originate from the Middle East or elsewhere, there's 3 components you need to look at: the money that funds these networks, the people who are in these networks, and the equipment, whether it's guns, arms, conventional or non-conventional, that need to be monitored, contained, identified. And so those are the 3 different components to it. To your question on the FTO designation, that is a very important tool that can be used in terms of trying to choke off the ability of these organizations to access legitimate financial institutions, to sanction and create a much greater risk for any entity, whether it's an individual or corporation that seeks to aid and abet these networks. And so it's really key, but it's only one tool among many that really need to be deployed to address this issue. I'm really glad that my colleague mentioned the tri-border area, because that has been, I think, one part, and I think most people here are familiar with it. It's the region between Brazil, Paraguay, and Argentina. And this is something that's been on the radar screen of the United States at this point for at least a quarter century, perhaps more. And I think that there has been a lot of progress made over time in the 3 countries in South America working collaboratively to address some of the challenges from counterfeiting, illicit activity that takes place in that area. It's too soon to say whether this new agreement is a model for future cooperation, but it's a very interesting development that's worth watching. In terms of the question of kind of people and tracking who's moving in and out of the region of Latin America, when we saw the massive migration wave that moved through Latin America, South America, and Central America in the post-COVID environment, so in the early 2020s, there were a lot of challenges that this posed to countries across the region, of course, the United States. And one set of steps that was taken was to really increase the capacity of countries in Latin America and Central America to know who is coming across their border, what nationality, who's arriving, better border control systems. We have in the audience the former Deputy Foreign Minister from Panama, who personally played a huge role in this effort. But Panama as a nation was a tremendous partner in managing this set of issues. And so I think that, while we're all familiar with the challenges of migration in the first half of this decade, one positive dividend that came out of that is the capacity for countries to know who's coming in and out of their borders and to share that information with their neighbors and with the United States. And then lastly, on this issue of both conventional and unconventional weapons that could pose a threat, illicit arms trafficking is a major issue throughout this region. When I was in government, we set up a counter arms trafficking task force in the Caribbean specifically to look at that region, but there are others as well. And I think this is a piece too where there's really no single one agency of government that can solve it, either in our government or in other governments. I was at the Pentagon, so we had a set of military tools and intelligence that we could use. But we worked very closely with DHS, with the Department of Justice, with FBI, with others, and also our partner countries had to strengthen their own interagency cooperation.
Excellent. Thank you, Dan. Recognizing the time, I wanted to see if there are any questions from the audience, and I see if there's a microphone. Thanks, Miguel. We'll bring it over to Carlos here in the front here. So turn it over to Carlos Ruiz Hernandez, former Vice Foreign Minister of Panama. Thanks so much, Carlos, for joining us and your question.
Of course, thank you, Jason. First of all, thank you to FIU and the Technical Council for hosting this very important conversation. And just to pick up a point that Dan was making and another point that was mentioned before, let me just share for a second a personal experience that I had with all the threats that you described. There was a few months ago, I was interacting with my president, or who I thought was my president. It was a Saturday morning, and it was asking me about information. In Panama, we tend to do everything via WhatsApp, Signal, whatever it is. And it turned out that it wasn't the president of Panama. It was a cell working from, an Iranian cell working in Venezuela, which eventually we found out. But I think it highlights and colors precisely what you're talking about. And the question is about data, of course. It's a twofold question. The biggest challenge that I saw at the minute, and I worked with Dan and I was tasked with the idea, like, how can we work in the United States? What are the areas that we can work with, outside of great power competition, natural disasters, migration, and the usual in Latin America? And the Middle East was one of them, because Panama is right now a member of the UN Security Council, and I thought the Middle East and the threats would be. And we came up with the idea to highlight that some of these non-state actors are well-funded and in instances better funded than governments themselves. And that's the biggest challenge. And I struggle after that event that I, obviously my president was sleeping at the time. That's how I found out that something was wrong. And a few weeks after that, and this is all public, it passed. I mean, the few people I had working in the Middle East in my ministry knew about it. I knew about it. The president knew about it. But then, as things go, so it wasn't a policy. It's not it's instituted at the level of policy and the relationship that we have with the United States, particularly this type of threat. So I started thinking, I was like, so I started thinking about data. How can I show to the governments and to the politics to find a political will to address this as a macro issue? And I struggled to find that data. I mean, I had the points that Dan was making. I knew the people that was crossing, Hezbollah, Afghans, and they're all coming here, and they have their personal agendas. All of that was there, but then it has to be more, because these people are cells are way more organized. And then I fell into the trap of, okay, well, I need funds to create a task force or more MOUs that end up in nothing. Or I fall into the trap of thinking that, okay, the U.S. is going to fund everything for us, and then and that's when you hop the hoops of bureaucracy, and then, so data, like, what are the data points that we can probably use? And then eventually, through think tanks like the Atlantic Council, friends like Kevin in Panama that talk often how this is where you should focus on, so that, in the case of Panama, taking the Panama Canal back is no longer a conversation, and then we can actually focus on these type of problems. So.
Excellent, Carlos. Thank you, not both for the question, but also for the insight and for sharing that incredibly real example that you had to deal with. Erik, I see you want to pick up on that?
Sure, or any other colleagues. But in terms of, and I can send you my article from this summer. I mean, it's very academic. I'm not, as entrenched in the policy world. But, I basically tracked the relationship between Iran and Venezuela and other Alba states from the early 2000s until, as recently as possible. And I really stayed away from the non-state actors because I couldn't get good data, in terms of illicit activity, right? Which I'm sure maybe people, undisclosed locations can get better data than me. But just looking at state-to-state data, an interesting pattern that I found is, right, so, and I won't get into theories of wedge strategy, but there's a scholar named Tim Crawford who looks at how the United States could make try to drive a wedge in these relationships, right? And he looks at the stick and carrot approach, coercion and co-optation. And right now, we're almost entirely talking about co-optation, FTOs, sanctions, et cetera. But one of the trends that I saw is, looking at critical junctures where the U.S. gets more coercive with these states and when it gets less, right? When it actually engages these states. And let's not forget, before the 12-day war, Iran and the U.S. went through 5 rounds of nuclear negotiations. So one thing I found is that when the U.S. gets more coercive, when there's more FTOs, when there's more sanctions, you actually, when you look at data like trade and investment, and you look at those databases, they go down because these countries are under constraints. And again, this is a correlation, not necessarily causality. At the same time, you see an uptick in other data points. Like I mentioned, official visits, agreements signed, right? So on the one side, it imposes constraints on these relations. On the other hand, it increases the incentives for them to be more proximate or to engage more closely with one another. The times where you actually saw less engagement was when the U.S. actually engaged these countries. Like under President Rouhani, when they were moving towards the Iran nuclear deal, you saw those activities go down, and you even saw the rhetoric being dialed down. When these officials would meet together, the Iranians, particularly the Iranians, would talk less about anti-imperialism and more about economic and political relations. But you saw, a change. And then, again, when the U.S. withdraws from that agreement and reimposes sanctions on Iran, even the most moderate Iranian politicians are now talking about anti-imperialism. They're now going to meet with the Venezuelans more, signing agreements more, even if they're under greater economic constraints, right? So the question is at a strategic level, we're talking a lot about tactics, cross-border cooperation, intelligence sharing, FTOs. But, and again, I know conditions are very difficult to engage these countries. It's easier said than done. But, is that the key to driving a wedge? Because when the Biden administration started engaging the Venezuelans on sanctions relief, which may have, been a pipe dream to some, and, you again saw these, on the Venezuelan side, I didn't look at it as closely. So I could definitely say on the Iranian side, in 2015, there was less activity. Venezuela, I was asking myself, will there be less? Now that there's an incentive structure potentially for the Venezuelans to engage with the Iranians less, or again, is that?
Thank you so much, Erik.
Sure.
We're actually out of time, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to turn to the other 3 panelists just to either respond to Carlos's question or give a 30-second of kind of wrap up your thoughts as you're leading the audience insofar as what we should be looking out for insofar as trends in the Middle East and implications for Latin America and anything else we might not have covered as part of the panel. So I'll turn maybe to you first, Kirsten, just a quick 30-second, 1-minute wrap up.
Sure.
Yeah.
Minister, I think you raised an excellent point that is that we're looking at 2 tracks when we talk about terrorism under the rubric of the U.S. definition. One, as we've talked about, is the fundraising and the propagandizing, Hispan TV and the like, which is Iranian-sponsored. But the fundraising and the recruitment of fighters is to extract resources from the region to have them operational elsewhere. When you talk about the Iranian-sponsored and the kinds of things that targeted you, they see Latin America as an area of operations because it is the near abroad to the U.S. And the point is to drive that wedge between the U.S. and partners in the region. So it's 2 very distinct approaches and 2 very distinct problem sets. I think that's an excellent point. We certainly don't want to be myopic about what we're talking about here. And for this U.S. administration, there is a focus on both, but you'll get higher level attention to the kind of problem that you actually are facing.
Gabriela.
Yes, thank you. I think you raised a very important point, and the lack of data is a constraint, it's a challenge. I think that we need to work together, going back to this idea that there should be a connection between Latin American countries and take this issue as a priority. And basically from that, build on with international partners, regional organizations, international organizations. But I do believe that until we have the data, we understand that this is already in the region, that this is already already a situation that we're living. We've seen many, many examples. And the context is very volatile. As Erik has said, there are periods in which there is more incentive to kind of go beyond and actually get to the actual act of terrorism. Other times there is a more of a focus in terms of raise funds, money laundering, interact with criminal organizations and transnational crime. So we really need to do a quick understanding of what are the root causes of this situation, understand migration tendencies. I think that's critical. And we have, over the past decade, I mean, the amount of changes have been dramatic. So we are seeing a different context now. So this requires investment, requires systematization, requires human resources, requires political will. All this combined in order to address the complex security challenges of security implications of the Middle East and Latin America.
Thanks, Gabriella. Dan, what might we not have spoken about as part of this panel that we need to be thinking about insofar as the U.S. approach and any last-minute thoughts here as we wrap up?
Sure. Well, I mean, I think we've covered a lot, but there is a lot that's left out. This is we're talking about two very dynamic regions, right, that have an intermix of a variety of types of relationships. Some, I would argue, positive, but many are negative or potentially dangerous, and clearly this illicit threat network we're discussing is one of them. I think one thing I will mention, just because no one's mentioned it, we're talking about lack of data, but there's also this challenge of just processing existing data and connecting dots we already have. And so as we kind of start to move into this AI era, where artificial intelligence is being used to synthesize complex data relatively rapidly, there may be some applications that could be used here through law enforcement channels or other channels to help connect dots that we wouldn't be able to in real time as you have people, particularly senior decision makers, that are tasked with managing multiple issues at once and can't necessarily dive deep on some sorts of things. So I don't want to raise any specters of a kind of an AI state. I don't mean that, but I do think that there's ways that we could use the existing data more effectively and efficiently to root out some of the key threats and challenges.
And a last point on data too. We've been doing a lot of work at the Atlantic Council looking at how to. FIU does some fantastic work on data and security across the hemisphere. We do a lot of that increasingly these days, focused on organized crime and the data points in which organized crime. There's over 20 some odd activities in which organized crime is involved across the hemisphere, and so maybe there's an opportunity to further link that with data points with regard to terrorist organizations. I want to end by, again, thanking our incredible panel. Thank you so much to Kirsten, to Erik, Gabriella, Dan, for your insights. I think one thing that's clear as well is this panel could have started at breakfast and gone through to lunch, and maybe even through afternoon coffee and dinner, because we just started to peel back, as Dan was saying at the end, on a very, very complex topic. And I think it leads itself to much more research and work that we could be looking at. And this goes back to the incredible partnership, as Dean Dinar mentioned at the beginning, with Florida International University, the ability of FIU to bring together expertise across disciplines to inform policymaking, and then on the Atlantic Council side, the fact that we have 16 different programs and centers, and Kirsten's affiliated with our Middle East programming, and Dan on the Latin America side. So that really brings about being able to have kind of rich, not only conversations, but insight analysis on what are increasingly more connected global geopolitical, strategic, economic issues that need to be tackled in a much more comprehensive way. So thank you all so much for joining us again today, and thank you to our panel.